There are moments in war that lie beyond every battle plan and exceed anything people are prepared to face. Moments when the deck begins to tilt, orders dissolve into the wind, and soldiers slowly realize that what is unfolding before them is far removed from what they were promised. On the morning of the 7th of April, 1945, on the deck of a ship once trusted absolutely as a symbol of Japanese naval power, a brief stillness lingered for only a few breaths before the sky suddenly grew heavy with the roar of engines and the pounding of explosions. Lines written by trembling hands appeared the instant order collapsed, faith fractured, and a quiet understanding took shape that whatever they had carried aboard this ship would not bring them back as they once were. From that moment on, the deck of the Yamato became a boundary where the thinking of everyone standing upon it was changed forever. Yamato was launched in late 1941 as the trump card placed at the very center of the Imperial Japanese Navy's pride. With a displacement of over 70,000 tons, massive armor plating, and a battery of 460mm guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, the vessel was regarded by Japan's military leadership as the ultimate affirmation that power at sea still belonged to the battleship. On her decks, that belief spread naturally. From commanding officers to young sailors entering war for the first time, all were convinced that Yamato had been born to dominate, to withstand any blow, and to advance in decisive naval battles. Lieutenant Mitsuru Yoshida later recalled that he was certain Yamato would never sink, and that the thought of dying with the ship never crossed his mind during his early years of service. That confidence came not only from her size and firepower, but from the doctrine of the decisive fleet battle, deeply embedded in Japanese naval thinking, where super battleships like Yamato were expected to determine the fate of the entire war. But war does not stand still to wait for assumptions to become reality. By early 1945, the balance had shifted decisively. The U.S. Navy, after a series of island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific, moved close to Japan's home territory with overwhelming superiority in aircraft carriers and naval air power. On the 1st of April 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa, the last island standing before the door to the Japanese mainland. That news forced the Japanese High Command into a final all-or-nothing gamble. Operation Tengo was born out of that moment, with Yamato ordered to leave port, accompanied by a small escort force, and drive straight toward Okinawa to confront the U.S. fleet. Admiral Toyoda declared that the fate of the empire rested entirely on this sortie, calling it the most heroic act the Imperial Japanese Navy could still carry out, and with those words, the order was transformed into a sentence passed down in the name of honor. On the 6th of April 1945, Yamato departed Tokuyama, cutting through the waves as she headed out to sea under the weight of heavy farewells. On board, everyone understood that the fuel was sufficient for only a one-way journey, even though few spoke of it aloud. Younger sailors tried to maintain an air of optimism, drinking sake at a farewell gathering and laughing loudly to drown out the unease quietly spreading among them. Senior officers, by contrast, were more silent than ever, fully aware of the nature of the mission and of the ship's real limitations in a war that had already changed. Yoshida later recalled that night, amid laughter and the haze of alcohol, there were still whispers acknowledging how fragile the plan truly was. Even so, the spirit of Yamato was carefully preserved. The crew was ordered to bow toward the imperial palace and sing familiar military songs, reminding themselves of duty and loyalty. As the ship left port, confidence, pride, and a faint, fragile hope coexisted and blended together, carrying Yamato into a voyage whose true cost no one on deck at that moment could fully imagine. On the morning of the 7th of April 1945, the Japanese fleet, led by Yamato, advanced into the waters north of Okinawa in a state of high alert. The sea was unnaturally calm, the surface grey beneath a low, heavy sky, as if nature itself were holding its breath in anticipation. On deck, gun crews had taken their positions early. Sailors moved with short, decisive motions, and every action carried the familiarity of drills repeated over many years. No shots had been fired, No bombs had fallen, yet no one regarded this as an ordinary morning. Just before 11 a.m., the first signs appeared. American reconnaissance aircraft lingered in the distance, not attacking immediately, but keeping just enough distance to shadow the Japanese formation like silent spectres. To those on deck, they were only small dots against the grey clouds. To those below, in the radar control room, they were a clear warning that Yamato had been found. In the cramped radar compartment, Lieutenant Mitsuru Yoshida stood before the dimly glowing screen, straining his eyes to follow each trace. Each sweep passed slowly and steadily, stretching time itself as the inevitability of what was coming settled in. Then came 12:20 p.m., a moment Yoshida would later remember as a cold, clean cut. A single bright point appeared on the radar screen, then another, then another. Within seconds, the isolated dots merged into dense clusters, spreading across the display like ink bleeding through paper. Yoshida froze. No one needed to explain what it meant. From his training and experience, he understood immediately. This was not a small flight, not a probing attack. It was the full weight of the enemy's air power moving straight toward them. Almost at the same instant, the alarm siren tore through the still air aboard Yamato. The piercing sound echoed through the ship's steel body, reverberating down corridors and into every compartment, snapping the crew out of the tense waiting that had preceded it. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Kosaku Ariga did not hesitate. He shouted the order that had long been prepared in his mind. "All hands, man your battle stations." Yamato swung her bow, engines roaring as the massive hull accelerated to nearly 25 knots, driving straight east, directly toward the incoming aircraft. There would be no evasive maneuver, no attempt to flee. The decisive battle they had been anticipating, in their own way, had finally begun. From the bridge, Ariga watched the first American aircraft emerge from gaps in the low cloud cover. They appeared suddenly, sharp against the grey sky, and immediately dove like hawks, striking prey. Jaw clenched, he issued the brief command. "Open fire." What followed was everything Yamato could unleash. Dozens of 127mm anti-aircraft guns erupted almost simultaneously, followed by more than 125mm machine guns shrieking without pause. Explosions overlapped in rapid succession until it became impossible to tell one gun from another. The steel deck shuddered violently. The recoil from the guns powerful enough to hurl seawater into towering white columns beside the hull. Above, the dull grey sky flared with thousands of flashes as anti-aircraft shells burst again and again, weaving a lethal net across the air. Amid the overwhelming din, Yoshida gripped his weapon, feeling his entire body vibrating with each concussion. The roar of American engines, the whistle of falling bombs, the heavy thuds of rounds slamming into the ship's armor all rebounded together, like massive sledgehammers pounding the deck without mercy. To Yoshida, the sounds no longer registered as individual gunfire or explosions. They fused into a single, relentless symphony of destruction, without pause, without rhythm, leaving no space to think. Yamato, the ship he had once believed to be invulnerable, was now shaking violently under a force unlike anything she had ever endured. In a fleeting glance toward the smoke-blurred horizon, Yoshida suddenly grasped the bitter gap between expectation and reality. He had once imagined a great naval battle in which Yamato would unleash the full power of her 460mm guns, firing directly at the American fleet within visible range. But what was plunging toward them now were not enemy warships. They were flying fortresses, attacking from altitudes Yamato's main guns could never reach. SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers dropped almost vertically, releasing heavy bombs onto their target before pulling up in a matter of seconds. Anti-aircraft gunners swung their barrels continuously, firing until the metal glowed red, yet many targets fell too fast to be tracked with any real precision. A sharp explosion tore through the air from the stern. One 127mm gun mount took a direct hit, erupting in a violent blast as flames swallowed the entire gun crew in an instant. Before anyone could recover, another detonation ripped apart the space near the bridge. A bomb pierced straight into the radar room and exploded immediately. Yoshida was stunned to realize that the compartment just obliterated was the very room where he had been standing moments earlier, watching the radar screen. In the blink of an eye, everyone on duty there was gone. Smoke and debris billowed upward, blotting out a space that had been familiar only minutes before. Yoshida clenched his fists, pain and rage surging up and locking tight in his chest. At the same time, F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair fighters swept in from multiple directions, skimming low and raking Yamato with merciless bursts of 20mm and 50 caliber fire. The ship's thick armor could withstand most heavy bombs, but it offered no protection against shrapnel and armor-piercing rounds that shredded everything exposed on deck. Anti-aircraft gunners fell one by one beside their weapons, entire gun crews silenced as no one remained standing to fire. Ammunition handlers, firefighting teams, and medical personnel were cut down in rapid succession, blood mixing with seawater across the slick steel deck. Yamato was sinking into chaos, yet amid smoke, fire, and bodies, those still alive clung to their positions, continuing to fight almost instinctively, as if stopping for even a second would force them to confront a truth no one was ready to face. After nearly 2 hours of being hunted and torn apart by relentless air attacks, Yamato was still afloat, but she no longer moved like a ship in control of the situation. Thick smoke hung over the deck like a filthy curtain. Anti-aircraft guns had fired until they glowed with heat, and many positions were reduced to twisted metal and empty spaces where gunners had once stood. To Yoshida, time no longer flowed in minutes. It moved in waves of engine noise overhead and in the violent shudders transmitted through his spine with each impact. He struggled to keep his composure, knowing that once calm was lost, everything would collapse even faster than the ship itself. Then, just after 2 p.m., the third wave of air attacks struck like a final incision. The sound in the sky changed denser, heavier, as if the entire airspace were being pressed downward. Yoshida barely had time to make out the new formations when deep, heavy detonations slammed into the port side. 3 torpedoes from TBM Avengers hit in near succession. Yamato convulsed violently, not with the outward shock of bombs exploding nearby, but like an earthquake erupting from within her hull, a force surging up from beneath the deck, wrenching everything out of its familiar place. The entire ship lurched hard to one side. Men on deck staggered as if their legs had been yanked out from under them. Many were thrown to the steel, scrambling to clutch railings, cables, anything solid enough to keep from being flung away. In that instant, space itself changed in a literal sense. The deck was no longer a flat surface, but a sloping plane. Every step became a struggle against gravity. The lights went out. Deep compartments inside the ship fell into darkness, and that darkness was more than the absence of light. It was the sensation of being cut off from all the order they had known. Yoshida shuddered as he felt a cold current creeping upward from below. Seawater was flooding into the lower compartments, something no report was needed to confirm. It announced itself through the sharp, briny smell and the chill seeping through the metal. He understood immediately what was happening. The engine rooms and multiple sealed compartments had been torn open, and Yamato was being eaten from the inside by the sea. If it had been a single, small breach, damage control teams might have contained it. But under this relentless tempo of attack, Yamato was losing time, and losing time meant losing balance, and then losing control. Through the internal voice pipes came a strained order, no longer delivered with the confident authority of the battle's opening moments, but recited like a procedure amid chaos. Flooded compartments are to be sealed immediately, contain the water. It was a technical command, but Yoshida grasped its darker meaning at once. To seal meant to lock shut. To contain the water meant to cut off all escape. Anyone still alive inside those compartments would be trapped in darkness, and even if Yamato remained afloat for a few more minutes, their last chance would already have been taken from them. It was a brutal decision, yet in the logic of a sinking warship, it was the final measure to prolong the ship's life just a little longer. Under emergency lights flickering like weak heartbeats, Yoshida left his post on the bridge and forced himself down toward the lower decks. He did not do so because he believed he could save Yamato, but because he was pulled by a deeply human impulse. If there were still people below, they could not simply vanish without being seen. When Yoshida entered the deep compartments, the first thing that struck him was the smell oil, smoke, overheated metal, and blood. The sight before him froze him in place. The deck had become a sea of water and blood, strewn with fragments of bodies, severed limbs, and men lying motionless in postures that no longer belonged to the living. Broken groans echoed through the darkness, not screams, but ragged breathing, strained whispers, the sounds of men forcing themselves to endure without tipping into panic. Yoshida knelt beside a young sailor, gently shaking his shoulder and asking the simplest question imaginable. "Are you all right?" The man opened his eyes and looked at him, lips pressed tight, unable to form a word. Though his body was soaked in blood, he nodded faintly, as if to say he could still endure, or perhaps to preserve one last shred of dignity before a fellow sailor. That small gesture made Yoshida's eyes burn. In the midst of hell, even a nod became a silent declaration that discipline still existed, that they were still trying, even though no one knew how much longer they would live. He moved on to 3 or 4 others who were dying, carefully lifting their heads and giving them their final sips of water. "Water, please, water." The plea repeated itself like a refrain. Yoshida felt fingers clutching at his hand, not with strength, but with desperation. He wanted to do more to pull them away, to carry them up to the deck, but he knew this was the first thing war took away, the ability to save everyone. Above him, the roar of aircraft engines grew louder, signaling that another wave of bombs was about to fall. Yoshida looked around and saw the corridor tilting, the water continuing to rise, the emergency lights flickering. He understood that if he stayed any longer, he would die there with them, and that death would change nothing. In pain and despair, he laid the wounded back gently, loosened his grip from the hands clinging to him, and turned toward the stairs. Behind him, the cries of, "Save me! Please don't leave me!" cut straight into his heart like blades. Yoshida did not turn back, not out of indifference, but because if he did, he would not be able to take another step. When he reached the upper deck, he witnessed the cruelest consequence of the order that had just been given. His comrades were sealing the flooded compartments, locking the wounded inside. Fists pounded against the steel doors, screams echoed off the metal, then were swallowed by explosions and smoke. Within seconds, the sounds vanished, as if the ship itself had sealed off a part of its own soul in a desperate attempt to survive a little longer. Yoshida collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. He knew it had to be done to keep Yamato afloat for a few more moments, but understanding did nothing to ease the weight. Helplessness and guilt surged over him like a wave. He murmured through broken breaths, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "War is cruel." Tears mixed with the salty seawater on his lips. The images of arms reaching through narrow gaps, of eyes filled with tears and pleading, he knew would follow him for the rest of his life, whether Yamato lay on the ocean floor or not. On the main deck, the situation had now passed beyond any possibility of recovery. Yamato was listing faster and faster to port. Seawater poured over the side, spreading across the steel, and turning the deck into a lethal sliding surface. Smoke and fire thickened, swallowing visibility. The internal communications system was dead, orders shattered into fragments, torn apart into raw shouts with no chain or structure left. The abandoned ship bell rang again and again, no longer a contingency signal, but a final admission that the ship was being lost. Yet even in that chaos, some decisions were made with chilling calm. Captain Kosaku Ariga, knowing Yamato could not be saved, chose to remain behind, lashing himself to the bridge column as a vow to sink with his flagship. Admiral Seiichi Ito cancelled the mission and ordered that surviving crew be saved, then shook hands with his officers one by one before withdrawing into his cabin. Those handshakes needed no speeches. The looks exchanged were enough. "Everyone to the deck! The ship's going to capsize!" someone shouted, his voice breaking through smoke. Yoshida moved at once, forcing his way through corridors now tilted at impossible angles. Water had risen nearly to his waist. He swam and climbed up slick stairways, his fingernails scraping against steel to keep from sliding back, as if the ship itself were trying to throw him into the sea. When he finally emerged onto the aft deck, the sight before him stole his breath. The bodies of anti-aircraft gunners lay scattered across the deck, beside their silent, lifeless guns. Black smoke still curled upward, flames smouldering in the hull like wounds that refused to close. Amid the devastation, Yoshida saw a boy, Yoshifuji, only 15 or 16 years old, being carried toward the rail by two sailors. A fragment of bomb shrapnel had torn open his head, blood pulsing weakly with each shallow breath. He was delirious, his lips moving in a whisper. "Long live the Emperor. Water, please." Nearby medics shook their heads. The wound was too severe. If they gave him water, he would die immediately. Yoshida helped lower the boy onto a stretcher, his hands trembling not from cold, but from the unbearable clarity of what he was seeing. A child dying on the deck of a ship that adults had sent on a one-way journey. Pain twisted through him like fire. He no longer prayed for victory. He prayed only that Yoshifuji might die peacefully, because this war had been so cruel that it did not even allow the boy's youth to reach adulthood. Minutes later, Yamato listed hard to port beyond any doubt. This was no longer a dangerous tilt. It was the moment the ship completely lost her balance. The massive steel hull, weighing more than 65,000 tons, rolled slowly over, like a giant creature finally surrendering after resisting to the last. The starboard side rose into the air, smooth and sheer like a vertical cliff, turning the entire deck into a deadly slide. Shouts erupted everywhere, no longer commands, only instinctive cries. "Jump! Jump now! Get off the ship!" Yoshida was pushed along by the surge of bodies toward the starboard side, now the highest point still within reach. There were no formations anymore, no ranks, no distinctions of seniority. Hands slipped across oil-slick steel, boots skidded out of control. One by one, men let go, slid off the hull, and vanished into the black water below. Before releasing his grip, Yoshida forced himself to look back one last time. In that brief, searing instant, the image burned into his memory was the immense body of Yamato rolling over, her massive propellers breaking the surface like the final sign of a living creature about to disappear forever. Then everything went dark as his body plunged into the churning sea. The impact with the water brought no sense of relief. It dragged Yoshida straight down into freezing cold, into a darkness thick with oil and blood. He lost all sense of direction at once. There was no up or down, no distance, no orientation. Deep below, Yamato's enormous propellers were still turning slowly, generating a violent vortex like the mouth of a massive whirlpool. Yoshida was pulled into it, spun uncontrollably, his body stretched and twisted like a strand of seaweed in a giant basin. The pressure crushed his chest, his limbs locking rigid as if they were about to be torn from his body. In the suffocating blackness, Yoshida fought to hold on to the last fragments of reason. Acting on instinct alone, he curled his body inward, clamping his hands over his nose and mouth to hold his breath, even as his lungs screamed for air. Bubbles, black oil, and seawater flooded his throat, a burning sensation tearing through it like fire. In his ears there was only a dull, endless ringing. He could no longer hear bombs or screams. "This is it. I'm going to die." The thought flashed through his mind, then dissolved into exhaustion. His will to live tried to pull him back, urging him to endure just a little longer, but his body was beginning to fail. Salt water filled his lungs. His consciousness faded. Darkness closed in, slowly and inexorably. At the very moment when the boundary between life and death blurred beyond recognition, a violent explosion ripped through the sea. At 2:23 p.m., on the 7th of April 1945, the battleship Yamato detonated. The immense stores of propellant and ammunition in her magazines ignited simultaneously, unleashing a blast like a volcanic eruption beneath the ocean's surface. The water convulsed, and a colossal fireball erupted above it, engulfing what remained of the ship. Moments later, a towering black mushroom cloud rose into the sky, climbing for kilometers and marking the instant Yamato vanished from the sea. Underwater, the shock wave spread like an invisible fist, pulverizing everything near the wreck. Sailors who had just managed to escape the hull were hurled away, their bodies torn apart by the pressure transmitted through the water. Yamato's hull split in two and sank to the ocean floor, leaving behind only a vast emptiness on the surface strewn with debris, burning oil, and motionless bodies drifting where a warship had existed only moments before. Yoshida knew nothing of what had happened. He had blacked out deep within the vortex. Yet it was the immense shock of the explosion itself that hurled his body out of the deadly whirlpool. Suddenly, Yoshida burst up to the surface like an object shot back from the depths. He gasped for air, then choked violently, his lungs burning from oil and salt water. For a few seconds, he had no idea where he was. The glare of the sun forced him to squint, and as his vision slowly returned, the scene around him sent a chill through his body. The vast sea stretched out before his eyes. Yamato was gone. There was no ship of any kind left. Only a column of black smoke rising in the distance, and a surface slick with oil, splintered wood, and bodies. Small, dark shapes surfaced and disappeared again with the waves. Am I the only one left alive? The thought cut through him like a cold blade. Then a wave lifted Yoshida higher, and he saw other heads breaking the surface not far away. Survivors like him, struggling to swim amid the oil-smeared water and wreckage. Yoshida let out a breath, not in joy, but in relief that the fear of being utterly alone in the open sea had eased. Even so, their number was painfully small compared to the thousands who had been aboard Yamato only hours earlier. He stood frozen by the realization that most of his comrades, his superiors, the faces he had just seen on the deck, were now lying on the ocean floor. Exhausted, Yoshida swam toward a large piece of floating wood nearby. He clung to it as a makeshift float, tilting his face toward the sky to breathe and gather what little strength remained. Around him, the sea gradually grew calmer, but that calm brought no peace. It was the stillness after catastrophe, where the few who remained alive were left to wonder where the currents would carry them next. From that moment on, the story of Yamato ceased to be the story of a ship and became the story of human beings surviving in a sea of despair. Yoshida clung to the floating wood amid the oil-streaked water, allowing the waves to carry him because he no longer had the strength to resist. Time was no longer measured in hours or minutes, but in ragged breaths and cramps rippling through his body. Only later did he learn that he had drifted for more than 2 hours after Yamato sank, but in that moment, each passing minute felt endless. The sea did not roar, nor did it rise into great waves, yet it was precisely that cold, silent stillness that drove people toward despair. The stench of burning oil coated the surface and clung to skin and clothing, making every body slick, freezing, and heavy, as if being pulled downward. The April seawater in the southern waters of Japan was far colder than many might expect. After the initial shock faded, the cold began to sink in deeply, causing Yoshida's limbs to stiffen in waves. Around him, other survivors were in the same state, clinging to anything that could float: planks, fuel drums, fragments torn from the ship's hull. At first, they tried to gather around a few larger pieces of wreckage, as if staying close together might increase their chances of survival. But with each additional person holding on, the makeshift raft sank a little lower. When a sudden strong wave struck, the raft tilted sharply, nearly capsizing, and everyone panicked, clutching at one another in desperation. It was in those chaotic minutes that Yoshida witnessed something he would never forget. A few men, weaker than the rest, their hands already numb, began to let go. There were no cries for help, no wasted movements. They looked around one last time, then allowed their bodies to slip from the piece of wood and sink into the black water below. For them, death seemed gentler than continuing to endure the cold, the pain, and a weight with no visible end. The ocean swallowed them silently, leaving nothing behind but a few small ripples on the surface. Yoshida himself was drifting dangerously close to that same edge. His body was spent, his hip throbbing where a fragment of metal had lodged when Yamato capsized. Each time a wave rose, he had to summon every remaining ounce of strength to keep his hands from slipping off the wood. At that moment, thoughts of war, honor, or duty no longer existed in his mind. There was only a single, deeply human wish, a miracle, some sign that he had not been completely abandoned in the open sea. Then, just as hope was nearly exhausted, that miracle appeared as a small black speck on the horizon. At first, Yoshida did not trust his eyes, but the speck grew larger, clearer, until the shape of a warship emerged. It was the destroyer Yukikaze, one of the few escort ships to survive the battle. When Yukikaze sounded her horn and raised signal flags announcing a rescue, Yoshida felt a final surge of life ignite in his chest. Around him, heads that had been bowed in exhaustion moments earlier now lifted, eyes flashing briefly with hope. The ship cut through the water toward them, yet even then salvation did not come at once. American aircraft were still circling overhead, forcing Yukikaze to keep a safe distance until the threat of attack had passed. For those drifting in the sea, the wait became another trial. Yoshida clenched his teeth, telling himself that after enduring so much, he could not collapse just before rescue. More than 2.5 hours after Yamato sank, Yukikaze finally moved in close to the survivors. The destroyer came to a halt and lowered nets and ropes into the water. Yoshida released the piece of wood and swam toward the ship with the little strength he had left. When his hand closed around a rope, he gripped it as if it were life itself. But climbing was another ordeal. His exhausted body barely responded, his hands slick with oil and dried blood. After only a few steps, his vision darkened, his head spinning, and he nearly lost his grip, coming within inches of falling back into the sea. From the deck of Yukikaze, urgent, encouraging shouts rang down through the air. "Hold on, you're going to live." The words were simple, but they carried the power to pull Yoshida back from the edge. He clenched his teeth and poured every last ounce of will into his numbed hands, climbing inch by inch. When his arms were almost completely without feeling and his body swung helplessly on the rope, a strong hand suddenly seized the collar of his jacket and yanked him upward. Yoshida was hauled over the rail and collapsed face down onto the deck. "He's alive! This one's alive!" someone shouted, the voice breaking between relief and disbelief. Yoshida lay sprawled on the destroyer's deck, his body coated in black oil, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Then a hard slap struck his face, followed by another. Startled, Yoshida's eyes flew open. Standing over him were 2 senior officers from Yamato who had also just been rescued. They showed no emotion, staring directly into his eyes to be sure he was still conscious. The blows were not punishment, but an attempt to keep him from slipping into a dangerous cold shock. When they saw his gaze react, they nodded and turned back to pulling others aboard. Lying on his back on Yukikaze's deck, Yoshida coughed violently, forcing air into lungs he had thought lost forever. Above him, the sky remained grey, and behind the ship the sea was still streaked with oil and debris. Yet in that moment, before the cold and pain fully set in, Yoshida allowed himself, for the first time, to believe that he was truly alive. And from that instant onward, the burden of survival began to take shape within him, weighing as heavily as the memory of those who had gone down with Yamato. As the sun sank over the East China Sea at the end of the 7th of April 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a loss without precedent in its own history. The battleship Yamato, the ultimate pride and symbol of Japanese naval power, had been sunk along with nearly her entire crew. 4 escort ships met the same fate under American air attack. In just a few short hours, more than 4,000 lives vanished into the ocean, leaving behind a void that no military report could ever account for. For Japanese society at the time, the catastrophe was too immense to confront immediately. News of Yamato's sinking was suppressed for months, not from ignorance, but from fear of acknowledging that the nation's greatest symbol of strength had collapsed in a way that could not be reversed. For the US, Navy, however, the victory carried an entirely different meaning. It was not merely the destruction of an enemy warship, but a definitive end to the era of the battleship, a final, unmistakable declaration that in modern warfare, control of the skies mattered more than any thickness of steel armor. Between those two perspectives, the fate of the survivors drifted quietly in a different direction. For Lieutenant Mitsuru Yoshida, the ordeal aboard Yamato did not end when he was pulled onto the deck of the destroyer Yukikaze. It was only the beginning of another struggle, one that was prolonged and no less severe. As one of the very few to leave Yamato in her final moments, Yoshida carried with him a memory he did not know where to place in the post-war life that awaited him. In later years, during long nights after the war had faded into the past, Yoshida continued to dream of the faces that had vanished beneath the water that day. In those dreams, they reached out charred hands toward him, mouths dry with thirst, eyes fixed on him like a question without words. Yoshida would often wake abruptly in the middle of the night, his back soaked in cold sweat, his heart racing as cries for help that should have long since fallen silent echoed again in his mind. These were not dreams of victory or defeat, but dreams of being alive while others were not. That realization became the greatest burden Yoshida carried. He did not regard his survival as an achievement, but as a haunting miracle. Why had he lived, while thousands of others had died? There was no answer complete enough to resolve that question. Perhaps, as Yoshida once told himself, fate had spared him not for honor, but to serve as a witness. To leave behind one living voice to tell what happened on Yamato's deck when order collapsed and human beings were forced to confront the final limits of themselves. After the war, Mitsuru Yoshida wrote his memoir, Battleship Yamato: The Final Moments, recording with honesty and without embellishment what he had witnessed on that fateful day. His pages do not attempt to justify events, nor do they try to turn death into legend. They are painful, sometimes cold reflections on the endurance of Japanese sailors who fought until their final breath, even while understanding that victory was no longer possible. In those moments, the spirit of the warrior does not appear as a slogan, but as a personal choice made when there was no longer any path of retreat. Yamato, the legendary ship, ultimately became a collective grave on the ocean floor, yet Yamato Tamashi, the spirit of Yamato, did not sink with the shattered steel. It endures in the pages of those memoirs, in the memories of the survivors, and in the story that later generations continue to revisit, not as a triumphant epic, but as a bitter reminder of the terrible price of war. Yoshida's writings do more than allow us to picture the moment when the battleship Yamato lost control and was sent to the depths. They also open a deeper view into the human beings inside the machinery of war. There, amid smoke and shattered steel, courage and fear exist side by side, and it is in that darkest hour that the truth about war becomes clearer than any victory, that behind every fallen symbol stand real people, carrying memories, pain, and questions that will never find complete answers.